everyone, and welcome back to the Legal Insight podcast by HHQ. And this is the final installment of our trilogy, three-part discussion, where we have Johnson and Khai with us to deep dive and dissect the very recent release of 3 new guidelines by the Department of Personal Data Protection on 30th April 2026. Now, just to refresh everyone again, the 3 guidelines. Firstly, the Data Protection Impact Assessment Guideline, or the DPIA Guideline, which we covered in the first part, and the second part, which is the ADMP, or Automated Decision Making and Profiling Guideline. And thirdly, which is what we're going to cover today, which is the Data Protection by Design Guideline, or the DPBD Guideline. In this episode, we'll be focusing on this final guideline, and we've discussed at length the previous 2 guidelines, which is the DPIA and ADMP guidelines. So if you've not listened to them, please go back and pause here and listen to those episodes first. Without further ado, we'll now jump into the last installment of our trilogy to discuss data protection by design with our favorite guests, Johnson and Khai. Johnson and Khai, welcome back again.
Good to see you, Zach. Always happy to see you.
Yeah, the last episode of the Law of Data trilogy.
Lot of the data protection.
So who's going to die?
I don't know. We'll find out. We'll find out today.
Yes.
Right. If you don't see me in the next episode, maybe. Now, Johnson, let's start right at the beginning. We have understood what DPIA is, and we have also understood what ADMP is in the previous episodes. Now we are talking about data protection by design. I must say, I'm not quite sure what we're designing here. And I trust many of our listeners feel the same. Are we using Adobe? Are we designing a house? Could you please set the stage and explain what data protection by design even mean?
Yes, love it. So data protection by design, we can understand that you are designing personal data protection into the process, into the system, into the particular program since the very beginning. So a lot of companies, they are only thinking of PDP compliance after they launch it, after they implement it. And that is actually the wrong way of thinking. That is why they call it data protection by design, because you actually want to design, you want to implement, you actually want to start right by building these PDP policies, PDP principles, PDP fundamentals into the processing activities since the very beginning. Let us just take one example. Let's say FI, financial institution, they may be launching a new onboarding platform. So before this platform goes live, the company, the FI, should already be considered how are they supposed to actually process personal data from the entire end-to-end cycle already. It means they have to actually understand what personal data they want to collect, how are they going to collect, how are they going to obtain consent, and then where is the data is being stored, and then where is the cloud that is being hosted, how long the personal data is being retained, and then let's say by the end of the retention period, how are they going to actually dispose, how are they going to delete or destroy this data. So that is the meaning of data protection by design. Because since the beginning, you want to think personal data protection since day one. It should never be an afterthought.
Sure, thanks. That's very helpful. And let me follow up on that, right? What is the purpose of data protection by design, and how does it actually work in practice? Because I imagine many companies may agree with the concept in principle, but in reality, it's quite difficult to translate that concept into implementation. Like data protection by design, it sounds great, but how do I actually design it from beginning?
Yeah, good questions. So if you ask me what is the whole purpose of data protection by design, the whole intention is more than just a culture. You want to become a governance. The governance is you want to always think personal data protection first. Because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies, data protection is always an afterthought. They only start thinking of data protection after a data breach. The moment a breach has happened, based on our experience, then company like, I think that right now we have to tighten our system. We need to take personal data protection a lot more seriously. But to be honest, it's already too late. Why? Because the data subjects already suffer damages. Data has already been leaked on dark web already. So that is why the whole intention behind is to think personal data protection first. You have to start right from the beginning, since day one. So the beauty of this data protection by design guideline, they just set up 4 key elements. They actually help us to understand the working mechanism of the whole concept. The whole understanding, the whole idea is that you should design the whole personal data processing activities around the rights, around the interests, and also around the protection of data subjects. It's never about how are we supposed to actually maximize the value of personal data, but how am I supposed to actually ensure the personal data protections is actually being safeguarded.
Sure. So instead of, it's just getting companies into the habit of thinking
Yes.
instead of profit first, we were thinking about protection first.
Exactly.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Okay, that's a hard thing to do. Khai, now let's shift gears slightly, right? Understanding that
yes.
data protection by design is about embedding these personal data protection principles within the design of the entire data processing operation. Perhaps let's pick a few principles to illustrate this in practice, right? Let's start with the general principle. How does this operate within data protection by design?
Yeah. So you picked an easy one here. So essentially, there are 7 personal data protection principles under the PDPA, right?
Yep.
General principle, I would say that it's the fundamental. It's the fundamental principle of them all. Essentially, under the general principle, data controllers, you need to make sure that you have valid legal basis to process the personal data that you want to process, and that the processing is only for lawful purposes only, and for purposes that are necessary or directly related to those purposes. And at the same time, whenever you are processing personal data, the general principle requires you to make sure that you only process what is necessary, in a sense that the personal data that you have collected for whatever purpose is adequate and not excessive. You don't collect every personal data just because you can, right? But rather they must serve a particular purpose.
Yeah.
So when it comes to applying data protection by design to the practice of general principle, it's essentially helping organizations to make sure that they have whatever elements, whatever components that I have just mentioned in mind at the point of designing a new data processing activities. To facilitate that, the guideline actually provide a checklist. Essentially, just running through a list of things to make sure that you have considered all these factors. Some of the items on the checklist would be things like predetermining the purpose of the processing and what would be the basis of your processing. I think that is the first step, right? If you want to do any processing activity at all, you need to know what is the purpose, what are you doing it for. And the other thing on the checklist is that to make sure that the purpose is as narrow as possible. So your purpose should not be too wide and too vague. It has to be very specific, right? What is the objective that you are trying to achieve from this particular processing activity? And another checklist item would be to minimize personal data that you collect and also process. Because, as I mentioned just now, the processing of personal data should be adequate and not excessive. If I know that the purpose that I'm trying to achieve is this, what are the personal data that I need in order to achieve all this particular objective? Then I should only be collecting this personal data. For example, name, NRIC. I don't need your address. I don't need your blood type. Why do I need your blood type? Right? If I just want to onboard you as my customer to use my software. So things like that. To put things into context, perhaps allow me to just give a quick example. A school, if they want to roll out and design a new customer registration portal. So to apply data protection by design in general principle, it means that they need to, at the outset, decide and determine what is the purpose of this new customer registration portal. Am I trying to solve a pain point? What do I have to, what does it serve? Is it only for onboarding purpose? Is it only for enrollment? Do I want the students' parents to have access to the platform as well? If so, what would be the relevant personal data that I need to collect? So with that exercise, data controllers can, at the point of designing the customer registration portal, have already gone through the checklist to say that, okay, we have considered all these relevant factors to make sure that we are in compliance with general principle of the PDPA when these new processing activities roll out.
Thanks, Khai. Now, that's helpful. But how about data protection by design for the second principle, which is the notice and choice principle? And how does that actually work in practice? Could you just give us an overview of that?
Yeah, a quick 101. Notice and choice principle, essentially, it requires data controllers to be clear and open and upfront about how they will be processing personal data of data subjects. What are the personal data that I will be collecting? What will I be using them for? Who I will be sharing all these things with? What I will be doing with all this personal data that you just collected to me. So that's notice and choice principle in a nutshell, if I may.
Yep.
So it requires, if we apply data protection by design, again, in notice and choice principle, it requires organizations to pay attention to a few things at the point of designing a new a new data processing activity. You need to make sure that when you are preparing that personal data protection notice to convey and communicate the relevant information to your data subjects. The wordings, the choice of words that you use, the sentence structuring, everything, it's clear. You need to make sure that there's clarity. You need to make sure that semantics, you are not trying to overcomplicate things in terms of your drafting, right? Accessibility. How accessible would this PDP notice be? Are you putting it on your website, or are you only providing a copy upon being requested? Contextual. You need to make sure that the PDP notice is actually provided to the data subject at the most appropriate and the most relevant point in time. Ideally, when they first engage you, when you first request for their personal data to be provided, right? That's the point that you should be providing the PDP notice to them. Essentially, it requires data controllers to think about the entire collection process, data collection process. At which point should I be providing and communicating the PDP notice and all this information to the data subjects? And how should I make sure that when I am drafting the my PDP notice, it's as easy to understand as possible for data subjects? So that's the checklist provided under the DPBD guideline, right? At the same time, DPBD also say that you need to avoid certain things as a data controller, because data subjects, they do have certain rights under the PDPA. They can actually say no to you in your processing. They can actually opt out of certain things if they want to, direct marketing, for example. When it comes to all these rights of data subjects, notice and choice principle and also the DPBD guideline requires data controllers to make sure that they avoid deceptive practices. Things like stirring, for example. If let's say a customer wants to delete their account, social media account, then there's a pop-up to say by the social media to say that, are you sure you will no longer be connected with tens of thousands of your friends online? You sure you want to do this? So things like that, stirring their emotion, trying to quote unquote guilt trip them to not delete their account, or overloading. Giving them, like, let's say I just want to unsubscribe to a particular mailing list.
16 pages.
Correct.
And assist.
I have to click on unsubscribe, and then what is the purpose? What is the reason why you want to unsubscribe? And then after you have provided the reason, then they ask you, since when have you subscribed to our platform? How long have you been subscribed? So it makes it very, very difficult. Correct. It makes it very, very difficult for me to even exercise my right. All this practice should be avoided. They are not encouraged. So that's something that the DPBD guideline is also trying to avoid.
Sure. Thanks, Khai. Now, Johnson, since Khai has covered 2 principles already, it's only fair that you take on the next 2.
I'm going to take 4.
You're going to take 4? That's 10.
We only have 7 though.
Now, could you walk us through data protection by design in relation to the disclosure principle?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to the disclosure principle, it's important for us to actually understand what is the fundamental, because ultimately when it comes to data protection by design, it's about how are we supposed to design the 7 principles into the program, into the software, or into the processing activities. When it comes to disclosure principle, we are referring that the company will be sharing personal data from point A to point B. Typically, the data controller, they'll be sharing personal data to a data processor. That is the very typical processing activities. I'll be transferring my personal data from my environment to a third party's environment. When it comes to disclosure principles, a very high level understanding is I should only be transferring personal data to a third party if I have your consent, or otherwise I should have very good, valid legal reason for me to do that disclosure. Otherwise, whatever that I'm doing will be illegal. It's actually not appropriate. And even if I have your consent to actually transferring personal data from point A to point B, for example, if you give me consent to transfer personal data to a vendor, business partners, or even outsourced service provider, it's important within a PDP notice, I should know exactly who are the third parties that I'll be transferring to. I need to have a very clear list, who am I be transferring to, and also for what purpose. When it comes to the PDP guidelines, which is the data protection by design guideline, they make it very clear by saying that if a companies, you want to really embed the whole idea of disclosure principle within the processing, they actually provided some items for you to look into. Those are the checklists. Number 1, they want to understand what are the purpose for you to actually transfer personal data to any third party, what are the legal basis. have you received consent? And then if you are not relying on consent, what are the legal exceptions or legal basis that you're relying for to do the disclosure? Then similarly, how are you going to disclose the personal data to any third party? And then how safe is it? And then the moment I'm going to transfer personal data from, let's say, company A to a delivery company, then for company B, how are they supposed to also ensure the safety or the security of my personal data? Because right now, personal data has already left my environment. So how are you going to rely on any kind of measurements or even contractual obligation to really ensure they don't mess up? They will actually take my personal data seriously.
Thanks, Johnson. Now, and finally, how does data protection by design apply to the retention principle, and how should organizations think about this in practice?
When it comes to retention principle, the idea is quite straightforward. So every company, you are allowed to retain personal data, but the idea is you are not allowed to retain personal data forever. It cannot be infinite. At the end of the day, the moment the purpose of me processing of personal data comes to an end, then you should cease processing. After you cease processing my personal data because you already met the objective, then you should be doing one thing. You should find a way to properly destroy or properly remove my personal data. And then there are different mechanisms. You can actually destroy it. You can even anonymize it. The intention is you are supposed to make sure that my personal data is either not within your environment anymore, or otherwise they are not able to identify it or cause me to be identifiable. So that is the whole intention of retention principle. Let's say if I'm going to design a system, I should know it very clearly. Actually, how long am I supposed to retain your personal data? And then at the end of the processing purposes, when it comes to an end, then what am I supposed to do next? Am I still supposed to retain for another, let's say, 3 years? Then after the 3 years period, what am I going to do? So am I going to dispose it? Am I going to destroy it? Am I going to anonymize it? Then how am I supposed to do it? It means that the company, before they launch the system, they already be thinking of retention already. And then more than just thinking of retention, they are also actively finding out what happened at the end of retention. So there is the meaning of you want to design retention principle even before you launch your product or you launch your platform.
Thanks, Johnson. And yeah, at this point, as the end user of all these platforms, it's just so interesting because from my point of view, I only see the form, right? I only see like, okay, I have to key my name, my credit card details, or my address in certain instances. And for, banks probably have to scan my face, do a 3D scan. And it's interesting that all these principles have been thought through before this form even reaches me.
Yes.
And hopefully it actually follows the principles that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's the most important part.
Yeah. So Khai, it does seem at this point that data protection by design is heavily rooted in governance.
Exactly.
Now, from a practical standpoint, how should a company actually approach governance to ensure compliance is meaningful and it's being complied with? Yeah.
This is it's one of the very first few points that Johnson actually mentioned when it comes to DPBD. Is actually very governance. It's something that closely relates to governance, right? The DPBD guideline actually makes it clear that in order for data protection by design to work, it requires commitment from senior management. So you need strong senior management support. If senior management doesn't even care about data protection, right? So why would employees, why would the HR team, why would the legal team, why would be the business team, marketing team, why would they even care about data protection? Because my bosses, they don't even care, right? Yeah. So it has to be a top-down approach. It has to be something that comes from the senior management. I think that's why governance would be important, so that there can be you can cultivate a culture of data protection within the organization. And also when it comes to resources as well, it's only when the senior management buys into the concept of personal data protection that you can get resources, that teams can get resources allocated for them to invest in the necessary processes and the necessary measures to ensure the protection of personal data, right? So you need to make sure that the right protocols need to be in place to say that, okay, I need to have, say, someone who is very well versed with personal data protection to sit on the board, to advise the board, to advise the senior management on personal data related matters. And I need to build into my processes certain checkpoints to see, okay, at this point in time, we need to make sure that we think about personal data. We need to think about should we review our processes to see whether the personal data that we are collecting is actually adequate, to see whether do we really have to disclose all this personal data to the third party? Is this necessary? Is that relevant even? Should we delete this? Should we no longer retain this personal data?
Yeah.
So on and so forth, right? Ultimately, there needs to be a framework, a governance structure that is to be put in place to help organizations to comply with the PDPA.
Yeah, so perhaps DPBD, or data protection by design mandates that, this doesn't just sit with the legal team. This thing is actually permeated throughout the culture of the firm or the company.
Yes.
And perhaps a good place to start if senior management has not bought into the idea of data protection by design is to buy the book for your senior management, like the book by Johnson and Khai.
Yeah, it should be a mandatory read.
Yeah, it should be a mandatory required reading for senior management, running companies in Malaysia. Now, Khai, this does feel like a significant undertaking to implement, data protection by design. It's a big thing. And for companies listening who want to move forward with this, but they're unsure where to begin, could you share some tips to get started?
Yeah. I love my tips. I've been giving tips in the past few episodes, right? Okay, let me see. Perhaps I will give two to three tips this time around. Essentially, if you want to start implementing data protection by design in your workflow, you need to first identify what would be your key processing operations involving personal data. Because at the end of the day, this leads me to my second point. Second point is to introduce privacy checkpoints. Yeah. Privacy checkpoints essentially is checkpoints. They are checkpoints that you introduce in your workflow, certain point in your workflow, to make sure that you review your processing activities to ensure that the adequacy is there. All the personal data that you need to collect is adequate and you're not collecting anything unnecessary. And if you're onboarding new vendor, for example, you make sure that you do your background check on this particular vendor. But in order for you to introduce all these privacy checkpoints, you need to know, so go back to my first tips again, you need to make sure that you know your key processing operations. You need to know when do you collect personal data? How does the personal data flow? From this department, it may actually go to another department for further processing, and then go to a third department for storing, and who will actually be disclosing personal data out. So only by understanding key processing activities can a company then introduce the relevant privacy checkpoints to make sure that they actually think about personal data. They actually review personal data processing activity at the relevant point in time. Sure. So the last tip that I actually want to mention is to make DPBD cross-functional, because data processing activity within an organization is actually cross-functional. I mentioned just now, there'll be a team that runs the collection of personal data, but the actual processing of the personal data may not be the team that actually collects it. It may actually flow to the marketing team, or flow to the HR team, or the business team, or product development team, right? Yeah. All these people will then be the recipient and the user of personal data down the road. So because processing activity is cross-functional, it only makes sense that DPBD is also cross-functional.
For sure. Procurement team as well, when you're selecting vendors, how do they actually process data? It's important. Now, thanks Johnson and Khai. Thanks Khai for those very important tips as well. I think that was very helpful and a fitting way to close our trilogy. Nobody died. Having gone through the DPIA guideline, the ADMP guideline, and now the DPBD guideline, I cannot help but feel that these three guidelines send the clearest message yet that personal data protection in Malaysia is actually moving from the margins to the center of corporate governance. And it is so important, as enlightened by our two gentlemen here. Now, thank you, Johnson and Khai, for enlightening us. For in-house counsels, this is certainly not just another regulatory update to be noted. It is a broader signal of where PDP landscape is heading next and why organizations should prepare not only from a legal compliance perspective, but also in terms of the operations, the governance, the strategic implementation perspective. So to everyone listening, if you have any questions on PDP at all, the DPIA, the ADMP, or the PDPD, all the acronyms, right? All the guidelines, please feel free to get in touch with Johnson and Khai, and we will be more than happy to sit down and have coffee with you at any time, any point in time. Thank you for tuning in to the Legal Insight podcast. We'll see you in the next episode.